Mr William Wragg to move the motion.
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed, Mr Robertson. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Now, we have had many debates in this House, both in this hall and in the main chamber, which have focused on the mistreatment of thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises at the hands of financial institutions who, in the wake of the financial crisis, as they sought to shore up their balance sheets, plundered those of their business customers. This is getting to be an all too familiar debate. Indeed, it is the fourth debate on which I've spoken, and as I look around this afternoon at my distinguished colleagues from across the House, I see many familiar faces who have taken part in previous debates. And many members will be familiar of the cases of hard-working businessmen and women who had their businesses broken up, livelihoods destroyed via acts of deliberate deception and fraud, systemic asset stripping, inflated charges and fees, all at the hands of their banks. With the passage of time, the issues that are exposed only multiply rather than diminish. I have spoken before at length about one of my own constituents, Mr Eric Topping, who lost hundreds of thousands of pounds, including his home and retirement savings, when his profitable building company was forced into liquidation by the Royal Bank of Scotland. But for every constituent, there are thousands more, 1,000 more SME owners across the country who were similar victims to this widespread malpractice across the entire banking sector, and today we speak for them collectively. I happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
For giving way. And would you accept that what makes it even more difficult for people is that those banks which are being financed by taxpayers are using taxpayers' money to legally fight these cases when they know that they've done wrong and they know that the victims don't have the resources to take them through the whole way through the court?
Correct. The actions of the banks and actions since are entirely indefensible. And it is for, I hope, the government to finally, as I will make reference to later in my speech, for the government to seek appropriate redress. And yet, while the Hansard column inches increase, meaningful actions to properly investigate business banking fraud and seek redress for its victims has so far been woefully insufficient. So today I would like to turn attention to the investigation of allegations of fraud by our crime prevention agencies and regulators, the role of financial institutions, and also the role that the government plays. As a nation, we pride ourselves upon the rule of law. Above the Old Bailey stands the gilded statue of Lady Justice. She carries the sword of justice in one hand and the scales in the other. She wears a blindfold to symbolise that justice is blind. It does not distinguish between the powerful and the weak. Yet for those who have been victims of the systematic fraud practised by the UK banks and financial institutions, such sentiment is nonsense. The statue representing their experience of justice would be heavily rusted rather than gilded. It would wear a blindfold to avoid having to see the activities of the financial institutions whose wrongdoing has ruined individuals and families, and its arms would be firmly tied behind its back to symbolise the lack of activity by both the police and the regulators. This week marks 10 years since the taxpayer bailed out the financial services sector, and the state continues to control a significant stake in certain institutions. 10 years on, confidence in the sector is low, particularly with regards to small and medium-sized enterprises. The nation has yet to fully recover from a decade that has seen the destruction of viable businesses, jobs and thousands of individual lives as banks frantically rebuilt their balance sheets following the crash, at the expense of their customers' financial well-being and at the expense of their own reputations. And here we need to be clear. The process of shoring up a balance sheet is a zero-sum game. For every winner, there is a loser. The losers here were small and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of our economy. And they lost because they did not have the resource, the legal firepower, or a system to support them. We're not saying that every SME business which folded over the last decade was viable, nor that every business was a victim of fraud. but we have seen clear evidence of tampering with documents, false witness statements, and the leveraging of a position of power and clout to drive many thousands of good businesses into insolvency. In a free economy, there will always be legitimate failures alongside legitimate successes. Many of these businesses have not been viable and may have not survived, but that does not make them fair game for mistreatment or worse, fraud. It just makes them easy targets. So I will happily give way again to my friend.
He makes that point. I just wonder if my honourable friend's aware that in 1 year alone, GRG, Global Restructuring Group of our division of RBS, made over £1 billion profit. So while you say these were businesses that may have failed, some of them, you rightly point out that lots of them were viable and had a lot of hidden assets.
My honourable friend is absolutely correct about the role of GRG. Now, following these cases of at times blatant mistreatment and fraud that we've seen consistently across the board, there is either a lack of willingness or capability from our investigative bodies, both civil and criminal, to pursue these complaints. Instead, the victims of mistreatment and fraud are left to go in circles, making a series of fruitless complaints. These are either directly to the institutions that defrauded them in the first place, who have a vested interest not to investigate properly, such as that of my own constituent and the Royal Bank of Scotland, or former SME owners who find themselves referred to a series of industry-led trade bodies or the Financial Conduct Authority, which does not take on individual cases. It is simply not good enough. The only successful prosecution for fraud thus far has been that of HBOS in Reading, and this was not down to the actions of our regulator, nor was it the Serious Fraud Office, which relentlessly pursued the truth to bring the perpetrators to justice. Indeed, the bank, first HBOS and then Lloyds after the takeover, insisted there was no fraud, despite there being a victim of losses in hundreds of millions of pounds. I will happily give way to my honourable friend.
Well, I'm most grateful. I just want to put on the record my personal admiration for Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley, Anthony Stansfeld, who personally saw to it that this fraud was prosecuted, and I hope that my honourable friend will agree with me that this isn't good enough, and that if the state is going to fulfil its duty to protect the public from fraud, it's going to be necessary for the government to find the money to equip the authorities to prosecute fraud cases without them coming out of individual PCC's budgets.
William Ragg.
My honourable friend hits the nail on the head, and I, of course, pay tribute to his Police and Crime Commissioner. But I also wish to pay tribute to a couple of people here who I believe are here in the gallery today, because instead of the authorities necessarily investigating, it was left to a couple of music producers from Cambridge, in Paul and Nicky Turner, to crack the case. And I hope they're here today in Parliament, and they're still fighting for compensation for other victims of the crime. Now, for their reward in bringing this to the attention of the bank back in 2007, they were branded as conspiracy theorists. The bank, first HBOS, then Lloyds, tried to evict them from their home 22 times, spending more on legal actions than the value of the home itself. It sent a top partner of one of the country's most regarded law firms to Cambridge County Court to watch the hearings. The Turnbull report, which details a comprehensive cover-up of the fraud from within the bank, notes the lawyers saying that once the Turners were out of their home, they would just need to accept their fate. This was not the pursuit of justice, but a witch hunt to silence whistleblowers. The Turners approached the FSA and the SFO and the Treasury. There was indeed a debate in this very room in June 2009 in which members and colleagues urged the authorities to investigate, but all they encountered was denials and deflection. The case, as my honourable friend points out, was eventually taken seriously only after Thames Valley Police recognised that the crime had been committed, and it took 7 years to complete. The resource of 151 officers and staff cost £7 million, with only £2 million eventually recovered from the Home Office. Thames Valley Police have stated that it could not have done it. That it could have done it in half the time and with half the money if only the bank had cooperated fully. Unfortunately, the scale of the difficulty of this fraud only serves as a warning for other cash-strapped police forces: investigate at your peril. The reality is this: white-collar crime like this is expensive and difficult to prosecute, and the agencies responsible for fighting economic crime simply do not have the resources necessary to tackle complex mid-tier banking fraud. The Serious Fraud Office only takes on a small number of very large cases and has a budget of £53 million. The National Crime Agency's Economic Crime Command has a budget of £10 million, and the newly established National Economic Crime Centre a budget of just £6 million. Compared to the sheer scale of fraud in the United Kingdom, which is estimated at over £190 billion a year, and given the potential for consequential losses, these investigative budgets are frankly insignificant. And for those who think this case may seem a one-off, it's important to note the processes employed by HBOS in this case, namely turnaround units, business valuations, and the use of insolvency, are exactly the same tactics seen in other complaints that the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Fair Business Banking has investigated, and which were found to be commonplace, as the honourable gentleman alluded to, across most financial institutions. The system is ripe for abuse, and we have serious concerns about it. Now, at this point, I wish to pay tribute to the incredible dedication of my honourable friend, the member for Thurston Moulton, and the member for Norfolk North, who is co-chairman of the All-Party Group. In addition, I want to thank the officers and members of the group for their significant work in the running through a thorough inquiry into how so many SMEs were abused by their banks, as well as exposing the scale of the issue and the mechanisms by which the fraud was conducted. The group have produced an important report identifying the shortcomings in the current investigative tools and bodies, and made vital recommendations as to how we might just start to unpick this sorry mess. I want today to reiterate the calls of the All-Party Group for a full public inquiry into the treatment of businesses by financial institutions. There are currently more than 10 different inquiries looking at different isolated issues. It is time we had a holistic approach. I will happily give way when I conclude my sentence, my friend. It's time we have a holistic approach to this and investigated the system as a whole. I give way happily.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way and for the work he's doing on this area. Does he agree with me that part of the whole tragedy of this case is the lack of transparency and the lack of independence, that people feel they cannot get fair redress, and now a decade later they still are not being treated fairly by those institutions?
My honourable friend is absolutely spot on. The levels of obfuscation from these institutions surely is quite suspicious if one suspected them of any wrongdoing, but I'm sure we can deduce our own conclusions from their behaviour. Now, on a civil level, the All-Party Group's proposal for a financial services tribunal has been well received, and we look forward to the government's response to the proposals put before it. It may at least provide a civil remedy for those who've been wronged, but we have been asked what happens when the civil mistreatment tips over into criminal abuse of power. Where is there to go? At this point, there's no satisfactory answer. The Thames Valley Police and Crime Commissioner, as has been said, believes that we should have regional fraud squads akin to our counter-terrorism squads funded by the Treasury via FCA fines and funds recovered from criminal gangs. We would wholeheartedly support these proposals. I'd finally want to add, whatever action is taken, it requires the utmost degree of urgency. This is so that more and more cases do not, as has already started to happen, run into statute of limitations or find documents and evidence becoming lost to the sands of time, or that individuals responsible and culpable leave the industry and witnesses become unavailable. Now, I look forward to hearing the response, so the contributions of members, and indeed the response of the Minister later this afternoon. As I've mentioned at the start, this is becoming an all too familiar debate, and I rather hope we're not going to be back here in 6 months' time reliving it again. And I hope we can resolve to agree a path of action which will see the tarnish to be scrubbed off Lady Justice, and that she can start to uncross her arms.